Ilan, I'm going to invite you up here so that you can start bringing your things up while I introduce you. So our second speaker is Ilan Wiesel, an associate professor at the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Melbourne. An urban geographer, the research seeks to develop knowledge that supports development of disability-inclusive cities. Ilan has led several studies funded by the Australian Research Council on everyday encounters between people with and without intellectual disabilities and on inclusive mainstream services for people with intellectual disabilities. Ilan has led various other projects, published extensively on affordable and accessible housing for people with disability, and supported decision-making. His MA was completed at the University of Tel Aviv, PhD in urban planning at the University of Melbourne, and he has been working as a senior research fellow at the University of Sydney until 2016, and his current position at the University of Melbourne. Ilan will speak to us about researching encounters between people with and without intellectual disabilities.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation and for the introduction. Can you hear me well? So I'll have 4 parts for my presentation today. I'll first talk a bit more theoretically about that concept of encounter. I guess just to bring some theory to, you can't talk about methods without really understanding the theory behind it. I'll talk a bit about the Encounters project that I was part of. And then most of my presentation will be about methods and consideration, methodological consideration in researching encounters between people with intellectual disabilities and other members of the community without an intellectual disability. And at the end of my presentation, I'll talk about a training resource that we developed based on our project. And if I have time, I'll show you a few videos that we produced as part of that resource. This project, this project on encounter was part of, I guess, most of my work on disability, and particularly intellectual disability, starts from this concept of inclusion. I spoke about that yesterday, so I won't repeat it today, just to say that most policy in Australia and globally, disability policy is framed around that concept of inclusion, social inclusion. And this encounter project that we've designed, I guess, try to understand a very particular dimension of inclusion. There has been a lot of literature and studies of this intellectual disability in particular that distinguished between community presence and community participation. Community presence was sort of theorized, conceptualized as just being in the community. So in Australia, we've had quite an extensive process of deinstitutionalization, the closures of institutions for people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. And most people with intellectual disabilities now live in community-based housing, so in the community. But that's just presence. Community participation was sort of the binary to that, was beyond just being in the community, is actually having meaningful, lasting relationships with other people in the community. But really the emphasis and the way it was measured and understood was about lasting relationships, a longer-term relationship that are understood as meaningful form of participation. And in our project, we wanted to think about the in-between space, what we call encounter. Those are all the sorts of social interactions we experience where we're in the community and meet people. If you live in a city, most people around you are strangers. I'm here in a room full of strangers. I met some of you yesterday, but I probably know your name and not very much more. And that's just life in a modern city. You're surrounded by people who are strangers. And much of your day is based on those encounters with other people who you don't know. And what we've tried to argue, and that's part of, I guess, it comes from literature in human urban geography, that there's a lot of literature on encounter, and the argument that those encounters are really meaningful because they're such a big part of our life. If you're constantly experiencing very difficult encounters, then you would feel you'll have a very difficult sense of belonging and inclusion in the city. Erin spoke about that a lot yesterday, the experience of being stared at or being taken photographs of. So those are encounters, and that's an experience of exclusion. But if your day goes by and you're walking around in the street or shopping centers and people either just ignore you or they smile at you and you have very, I guess, pleasant encounters with service providers, with people you cross, you feel included. You feel that you're just part of this environment, the urban environment. So we argue that encounter is something between community presence and community participation, and it is a meaningful dimension of inclusion. So that's sort of the theory of encounter, briefly. I guess I'll just add one more concept that was quite central in our work. It's the concept of conviviality. And I think the translation, so I'm not quite sure what would be the Hebrew translation. Chavruta kind of captures it, one part of that. I guess conviviality, you could, if you translate it literally, would be dukiyum, viviality is living together. But the concept comes from the idea of living together with difference. So it comes actually from critical race studies. The idea that a convivial encounter is one where people who are different, racially different, or in terms of their abilities, we don't eliminate those differences. Those differences are not ignored, but they're made unremarkable. It is just a very ordinary thing. And the thing that connect people, the conviviality, is those things that connect people, which are not necessarily sexuality, race, or disability. It could be very mundane things. It could be us connecting around a shared interest in academic studies, in disability studies, or if you're interested in arts and you go to the museum, you might experience connection with other people around your shared interests in arts. So those are the things that connect people. They don't eliminate differences, but they coexist with difference. So that's conviviality. And our argument is that convivial encounters are an example of inclusive encounters. And I'll talk a bit more about non-encounters. This is a very interesting theoretical question because most of our day we encounter people and there's just no interaction. Is that a form of exclusion? Obviously it's not, because that's sort of expected. But there's some interesting methodological questions around that. So encounters matter because of conviviality. There's also moments of recognition. When people kind of acknowledge your existence, when people nod at you, that's just a recognition that you're there, that you're present, that you're welcome. Encounters can turn into something more significant. Every friendship, every meaningful friendship that you have started from an encounter with a stranger. So it could happen. It's very rare, but it does lead eventually. Some rare encounters will lead to a friendship. And but even if it's not a friendship, you can become known in your community. People might know you by name if they repeatedly encounter you. But for us, if you experience an encounter, for every person who experiences an encounter across difference with someone who's different from you, whether it's around disability or race or sexuality, ethnicity, whatever type of difference it is, if there's some interaction happening and you might learn something about that person, you might also learn something about yourself through that encounter. So it has quite a transformative potential in terms of actually being able to challenge. Five. challenging prejudices. I'm not really following my notes, so... Okay. So the transformative potential of encounters is that we might be able to challenge preconceptions of other people, preconceptions of ourselves. We might learn something new about ourselves. So this is, I think, why encounters are so interesting, not just in terms of inclusion and exclusion, but beyond that as a much more radical idea. So we did a study to actually learn what happens when people, what types of encounter people with intellectual disabilities experience in their communities with other people who may or may not have intellectual disability. I worked with Christine Bigby, Jim Mansell and Julie Beadle-Brown were also part of the project as in a kind of advisory group, and Rachel Carling-Jenkins was a research fellow on this project. We had many participants with intellectual disabilities. We did interviews with them, interviews with their support workers sometimes or other carers, but we also did a lot of participant observations. Those participants invited us, so we asked them to invite us if they were willing to join them when they went out from their home to the public realm, and with their consent, we just took notes of the kinds of encounters that we have observed. And I'll talk a bit about the limitations, the ethical issues around observations, around interviews. We also did a survey of people, just people in different localities, and asking them about whether they've had these types of encounters with people with intellectual disabilities and whether they can describe those encounters to us, whether it did, in fact, challenge their preconceptions, and what impact that might have had. So I'll talk a bit about the different strengths and limitations of those different methods that we used and how we sort of try to make sense of those. A lot about also interpretation, and I'll give you some examples of the challenges in interpreting the data. And finally, I'll talk about the training resource that we produced. There's some of the challenges, just to kind of put some titles around it. How do you capture a thick description of an encounter? Does an interview allow you to do that? Can you really ask someone about the encounter, their experience, and get a thick description of that? How do you capture the emotional, sort of more reflective aspects of the encounter, the feelings that people experience? Would an observation capture people's feelings, their reflections, their thoughts during an encounter? Or would an interview do that? And how do you capture the longer-term impacts, like the way that people have changed after or because of an encounter? And those are the kinds of challenges we were grappling with, and I'll talk about the different methods we try to overcome these. I'll start with the interviews. Interviews, this is the landmark of qualitative research. So obviously has many strengths. It captures people's subjective experience of encounters. So if you wanted to understand what people felt, I think there was a comment earlier that people say, I think the comment was, people might not remember what they did and what they said in a moment, but they'll remember what they felt. So that's exactly it, I think. The interview might not give you a very precise description of a moment and what someone said exactly and what they did and what someone told them, but they will be able to describe how they felt in a very particular encounter. We struggle to get in those interviews very thick descriptions of actual specific encounters, but people could talk quite abstractly about types of encounters they're used to have. So instead of talking about one particular moment, they could talk about, I guess, repeated types of encounters they've had in their lives. From an ethical perspective, interviews, I think, are very ethical in the sense they give participants a lot of control over what data they share with you, which is an issue with observations, which I'll talk about later, where we observe, and we might observe things that people might actually not want us to observe about themselves or about the way that they experience their everyday lives. So that's a strength in, I guess, in interviews in terms of control participants have. People forget a lot about things that happen to them. They take a lot for granted. Like when we're trying to capture those very mundane, ordinary encounters that we experience, if you ask about that in an interview, people don't even remember or just take it for granted. They wouldn't really say much about it. So that's a weakness or a limitation in interviews. And for people with intellectual disabilities, people with significant communication difficulties, describing verbally an encounter or even how they felt could be quite difficult. In some cases, we involved support workers and carers in the interviews. That was, I guess, an option. We offered participants the option to have a support worker with them. And I think many of you would probably know that situation where carers, support workers become quite involved in the interview, where to the extent that they take over, which is always a challenge in research. And then finally, the other limitation, and that's true for probably every method that you use, that your interpretation of the data is always biased. And it's the limitation, it's just how. It's just a part of doing qualitative research. Here's one example, though, I think, of the kind of strength of interviews. This is just a quote from one of the interviews we did. I think it captures how can describe a particular form of encounter people experience and what it means to them, the feelings, the reflections around encounters. So Dory, who has an intellectual disability, told us she spoke about her co-residence in a kind of independent living complex that she lived in, and she said, you know, these co-residents, they were like supposed to be her friends from a policy perspective. That's why they developed this whole thing as a complex, rather than sort of separating it or kind of mixing it in the neighborhood. They brought it together so they'll have friends around them. But she said, they're not really my friends. I tolerate them, they'll tolerate me, and we all live happily. You can kind of capture the cynicism there. But it's not really a friend. And then she spoke about it's more the people that I sit with at sporting events. Those are the people that were meaningful to her. Those are just kind of ordinary encounters. She wouldn't know their names, but I don't know if you know much about Melbourne. Sport is a religion there, and they have Australian Football League, which is, I think it's only in Melbourne, but it's really a very big thing there. And for her to sit with the crowd and to experience those moments, for her, those were what I would describe conviviality, finding that connection around shared interest in sports, in a particular team. And that was more meaningful to her than the so-called friends or what policymakers thought would be her friends in that complex. So an interview captures that. We may have been able to capture it in observations, but to hear those words from Dory's mouth was very powerful. The observations, again, it's a very powerful method. It helps you get some very thick descriptions of actual encounters in the moment, in the natural settings. That's how the literature talks about that. You can see things, you can observe dynamics in the encounter that those people who are part of the encounter might not even be aware of. They might not notice. All the things they might take for granted, you can see them and you can take notes. You can include people with significant communication difficulties in that type of research and see what kinds of encounters they experience. And because you also see it in those so-called natural settings, you can actually take notes about the environment. And you can actually, for me as a geographer, we're really interested in the environment and in space and how different types of spaces produce opportunities for convivial or less convivial encounters. So observations were very powerful in understanding whether encounters happen on the bus, at shopping centers, or at libraries like I spoke today. That was very useful. But there's also many limitations to observations. We can't really know what people feel and think. You can guess. Sometimes you see on people's face whether they look sad or happy or upset. But it's always a guess, and you make a lot of assumptions about people's emotional reactions. So it's, again, the interpretation is highly subjective, probably more so than interviews. Your presence as an observer really changes the dynamics. If people know they're being observed, they behave differently. I think most people, so the participants who have an intellectual disability knew we were there and knew that we were researchers doing an observation, and they understood that. The people they encountered, those strangers in the community, they didn't know who we were. They saw us. I think they probably assumed we were carers or support workers. So I don't know how much that changed their dynamics of behavior, but it does change things. But because you only observe the thing that happens at that moment, you don't really know what happens after that. You don't really know if that changed someone's stereotypes of other people, or if that had would that encounter turn into a long-term friendship? You never know. So you're just at that moment. And then finally, in terms of ethics, I think observations are really intrusive. It's a very intrusive method. We had consent. Participants were really happy, actually, to invite us to do that. They wanted to share their lives with us. But I reflect today, we did those observations almost, I think, 7-10 years ago. And I'm trying to think today, would I do the same thing? And I'm not sure, because I think if someone asked me to do an observation with me, I'd probably say no. And so, yeah, it's very tricky and challenging from an ethical point of view. But yeah, I'll be happy to hear perspectives from everyone here, what you think about those ethical considerations. This is just an example of the notes. I think another example of what I thought was a convivial encounter and how the observation notes try to capture that. It was in a dancing class in a community center. And those are my notes, there are about 10 other couples, most of them elderly. And Jack and Jenny are two people with intellectual disability there. No one else other than them appeared to have a disability. There was a dance instructor explaining the moves of a tango dance, and they all kind of danced together. I just took notes how the instructor corrected some couples, but also those moments of laughter and joy that were happening in that moment, and everyone was dancing together. Jack and Jenny, they were really good dancers, but they danced slightly out of sync with the others, but it was accepted. It was part of that, and it was really just beautiful. I thought that was a very beautiful moment of conviviality. And there was a connection around shared interest in dancing, and the observation notes managed to capture that. But also, yeah, I think that's probably what I can say about this. But you can see how you can then use those observation notes as data in your reports. Then the third method and the final method I want to talk about was the surveys and interviews we did with other people in localities, and about their experiences of encounter with people with intellectual disability. We wanted to see what they experience, whether it challenges their stereotypes and preconceptions. We did. People answered our survey. I wasn't sure. We sent it out, and a lot of people answered it. We did sort of mail surveys. So we sent it in people's mail with a prepaid return envelope, and we got back quite a good response rate. We were actually able to quantify, which types of localities more people experience encounters like this, and what types of encounter, or how many people with intellectual disability do you know by name? Those kinds of questions, and we were able to quantify that. Some of the questions were open-ended in the survey, but then we also did follow-up interviews, so we were also able to sort of identify in a more qualitative way perceptions, prejudices people have, but also maybe some people told us kind of stories about how some of those conceptions were challenged when they started actually met a person with intellectual disability and had some kind of connection and conversation with them. It did challenge their preconceptions. One of the limitations there was that people don't necessarily know whether a person has an intellectual disability. A lot of people wouldn't know what's an intellectual disability, or they would confuse autism and intellectual disability, or even physical disability and intellectual disability. So we actually don't know if our data is about people with intellectual disability. We just know that people responded as if it was intellectual disability. So that's quite a significant limitation. And the other limitation is what we call social desirability bias. It's which people, when you interview them or when you survey them, they often tell you what they think you want to hear or what you think sounds right and enlightened. So they will describe themselves in quite a positive way. So the data would be quite biased in that way. That said, people often struggle to hide their prejudices. So the prejudices come out even when people try to present themselves in a more enlightened way. But there's an issue there also in terms of understanding that it's always just a discourse. It's never about facts. I want to talk about some of the challenges in interpreting data that we've encountered in our own work. One is around condescending behavior. So a lot of the observation notes, some of the other researchers on the team, it came up in a lot of notes where they described an encounter and they described a person with intellectual disability being treated in a condescending or patronizing way. It's like usually was being treated like a child in a very childlike way. It came out in a lot of notes. We interviewed people with intellectual disabilities. That never came up, not in those terms at least. It didn't seem to be an issue that particularly bothered them, the ones that we've interviewed. They did talk about wanting to be treated with respect, but often the examples that are described of being of disrespect were more being shouted at, being abused, rather than being treated like a child. And then in some of the observation notes, this is one example. Actually, there's the observer, Rachel, kind of took notes. She described that condescending behavior, that what she felt was condescending, teacher being condescending towards participants with intellectual disability. But then she wrote this sort of last sentence. She said, "This felt quite childish to me, the way that the teacher spoke, but Leah seemed to love it." So she felt, for Leah, the participant with intellectual disability, she wasn't bothered at all. She actually enjoyed that, I guess, type of interaction. So how do you interpret that? And again, I'll be interested to hear about your thoughts here, but does it mean, should we only really be focusing on the kinds of interactions that really bother or are meaningful to people with intellectual disabilities? Or do we take our own interpretation that being patronizing or condescending is unjust? It's a kind of a wrong way of engaging with people with intellectual disabilities. So it's a methodological question around interpretation, but it's more than that. I think it's a theoretical question about whether there is objectively or normatively bad behavior in encounters, or do you always have to really just take the perspective of people with intellectual disabilities, start from there, and it's a slightly different kind of way of understanding what is right and wrong.
And then about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah. The other one, I mentioned it briefly, is non-encounters. As I mentioned, most of the time we go out, most people we encounter, there's nothing there. There's a non-encounter. Is that exclusion, or how do you interpret that? One way to interpret it is, this is Erving Goffman, the sociologist who described civil inattention, which is described as a good thing. The world will collapse if we had to greet and speak to every person we sort of randomly meet. So civil inattention is actually a form of respect towards strangers, respect for their privacy. In a way, it's a form of inclusion. It's definitely better than staring, right? And it's welcoming by ignoring someone, and that's what we all experience most of the time. But then we know that some non-encounters are not that. They're not civil inattention, and that came through interviews, because you have to know the context, why people are not engaging. And sometimes people told us, that was from these surveys that we did, that they were embarrassed to make any contact, actually acknowledge a person, that they felt they didn't know what to say and what to do in such an encounter. Someone spoke quite candidly they were afraid that they will become overcommitted. If they started speaking to someone, then over time they will have to become their carer or something like that. And the other thing, a lot of people we observed went out to the public in groups, part of a group home. So there are 4 or 5 people. So other people just kind of stayed away from the group. So that was a barrier. So you have to know the context for a non-encounter, and that comes from interviews to understand whether it's civil inattention or avoidance. I think I've almost run out of time, so I won't show the videos, but I'll just say that we've produced a training resource based on those observations. We took the observation notes, and then we found a theater group that has actors with and without intellectual disabilities. They recreated those encounters that we have observed. We filmed it on video, and then we put it online, and that's being used by disability support services as part of a training for disability support workers. So they see those videos, they see the kinds of encounters, different types, different dynamics, and they have an opportunity to discuss it and reflect. You know, it's particularly focused around the practices of support workers and the things that they've done in those encounters. Some of them are really good, positive ways of facilitating what I call conviviality, but most of the time, a lot of these are things that really block and prevent conviviality. Even people, support workers, are really blocking encounters, preventing encounters from happening. So the training resource was meant to give that awareness and some tools for support workers to do a better job in facilitating an encounter.
Even you will be able to send this to us?
Yeah, and the training, I'll send a link to the training resource. It's free online. It's all it's being used quite widely now in Australia by a lot of services use that as part of their training. But I guess it also raises an issue. Now there's a lot of online resources produced for disability support organizations, and I'm starting to get a bit worried that they rely very heavily on those free online resources. We invest a lot of money and time in building these. They're, I think they're good quality, but it doesn't replace this kind of mentoring type of work that, we want organizations to do with their support workers. So there's also, with those resources, there's an issue, I think, that we need to start thinking about, because we've developed a lot of these after this encounter project. We did a few others. But yeah, now I'm starting to kind of think maybe we should find other ways of doing it. But I'll stop here so we'll have some times for conversation.
Okay, not all at once. Slava, do you want to take the 3 questions, some questions together, and maybe jot it down and remember? And
I wanted to ask if you shared the observation with the participants, if you took it back to them, because you talked about the intrusiveness of it. So maybe taking it back to discussing it with them could lower that.
Thanks. Yeah, we did. And because we were coming with the same participants again and again, so we had opportunities. We developed relationships with them. We were able to come back and sort of talk about those observations. And also with the actors in the theater group, there were different people. But when we gave them the scripts and we worked with them, they were also able to reflect on whether they resonated with what we saw and whether they had similar experiences. That was quite a powerful tool of sort of validating whether what we observed is common and how they felt about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also take the
apologies for being late and missing the first part of your talk. I think you may have answered one part of my question now with that example, but I was curious, you were talking about sort of reflecting on the types of observations that you did, and then you also have this amazing tool of these videos, and I was thinking about a way of combining them, and you mentioned this now, of having people, whether by then on video or within the interaction, so having scholars from both groups of the interaction observing and then narrating what they're seeing. So a participant would then be able to narrate that scene that we just saw, and then we have the person without the disability saying, oh, they're being condescending and looking down at them and all of that. And then with the same interaction, you'll have people with intellectual disability narrating the same scene, saying, what I'm seeing here is, and then it's the same scene. I mean, it's not a scene, it's an actual thing, but both narrating and then the interpretation then involves these 2 points of view of the two groups within the scene. And so, because generally speaking, just types of interventions that are, observing people kind of, I think we sort of phased out of that, and it's considered to be colonialist and all. So another way of, and I'm thinking about this as in other art projects, it has been done where there is no script. One person would have a storyboard, and then a person with an intellectual disability would then narrate those from their own experience, from the way that they interpret the script, and then it's sort of a combined project between these two communities. And it sounds like that's where you're going anyway. So I just want to hear more about the video.
Okay. Well, first, it's a fantastic idea, I think, to do that. What you suggested is showing the videos and then getting reflections, the narration. I think that's a great idea. We haven't done it, and yeah, thanks. That's a great project to do. I guess one of the other part was to work with the theatre group, and that's another project that we do want to kind of do, which is working with the theatre group actors. They're not just doing our scripts, but like you said, they're telling their stories. They're building their own encounters or examples from their lives, and then we film it, and then we do theatre shows. So that would be quite a meaningful co-production project. I think personally I've moved quite a long way since we've done that project towards co-production, and so my future projects will be a lot closer to what you're suggesting.
Adva, and then you're making me jobless. Yeah, and that presentation afterwards will tie into some things we're talking about.
Well, it was very interesting, and I wanted to ask about this very interesting gap that you showed between the interpretation of the observation for paternalistic behavior and the experience of people with intellectual disabilities that did not refer to that as a problem or at all. It's also something that I can see sometimes in children, that from the outside they seem lonely, but when you talk about that, they don't mention this loneliness. And I think maybe the paternalistic behavior is, you said it, their daily living experience, they're used to it, their expectations, and maybe it's also their way to be in a relationship, and to get some human contact that is relatively pleasant, accepting, attention. And I wonder if they referred in the interviews to sense of loneliness or wishing to be more included or being in contact. Did they refer to that in the interviews?
Maybe we take this is a test of your memory. Okay? Take Marie and answer together.
So thank you, but very interesting. I wondered whether you identified any differences within these encounters between, if you had any encounters, between people with physical disabilities and people with intellectual disabilities compared to non-disabled people and people with intellectual disabilities, if you had any encounters or any ability to make such a difference?
I'll start with the second question. The answer is no, we didn't. It didn't come up in our study, but it's really interesting to explore that. And I think, again, as I said, I've moved a long way since we've done that project, and it was sort of framed around encounters between people with and without intellectual disabilities, sort of binary. And I think opening it up, just encounters across difference, I think would be a lot more meaningful. And that would include, I guess, when you frame it that way, encounter with and without intellectual disabilities, it creates a sense that this is a more valuable encounter than other encounters that people might experience. And that's something that we've moved away from. And then the question about loneliness, I mean, that interpretation is really interesting. I haven't thought of it. I don't remember participants talking to us about loneliness or using that concept. But I do think, again, this is my interpretation, right? But like you said, with children, that they wouldn't say it, but from your side, you feel that they are lonely. And there were people we felt that all their interactions, because we built relationships with those participants, and so much of their lives was in very specific types of spaces, and very little interaction with other people outside of their co-residents and support workers and immediate family, if they had. Some of them didn't have that. So I felt some of them were very lonely, but it didn't necessarily come up in the interviews.
We have 2 minutes on the clock for a question and an answer. Nearly שאלה, בוס שאלת, אמר לא שאלה, I'm trying to be fair. Sorry.
I think more from a methodological perspective. First of all, it's wonderful to hear about research with intellectual disabilities, because I'm not sure it's out there enough because of its complications. So I was wondering if the research team had any training on using simpler language while interviewing to try and explain better the ideas that you were trying to get from the group. I forgot the other question I wanted. Oh, the observations, were they just you were one single observer? Were there more than one? Were there more of the research team? And did you use videotaping at all, or it was just visual?
We didn't use videotaping. It was just being there and taking notes. And initially I would take the notes as they happened, and later I would kind of have to stop that because I couldn't take so much. I would just observe. At the end of that, whether it's 1 hour, I'll immediately go out, find a quiet place, and take very long notes, and fill out sort of notebooks full of notes. We only had one observer at a time. We did try, I think Julie Biddle-Brown has a particular way of doing observation that quantifies moments of contact, and she really kind of tries to see how many seconds in an hour. That's part of active support, person-centered active support. So seeing how many seconds in a minute people are actually actively engaged. We tried to use that for a while, and we sort of gave up on that and just moved to purely qualitative research. And I forgot the beginning of the question.
Simple language. Do you use simple language?
Yeah, we definitely did. I can't say I've been trained in a formal way, but we've learned through engagement with mentors and experienced researchers.
Thank you. Very exciting, very unmethodological note, but the main thing I get from your presentation is that I really want to come visit you in Melbourne. We'll talk about that in a different space.